Welcome to this Getting Started with SharePoint Framework Extensions tutorial series, and this is tutorial 4, hosting extension from Office 365 CDN, aka Hello World Part 4. And this is the general availability September 2017 edition. And this tutorial 4 continues building or deploying the application customizer which we originally created in the tutorial 1. Then we extended that to have a application page holders or accessing the SharePoint Online page placeholders from our application customizer. And then part 3, we were actually hosting that from SharePoint and deploying that to the SharePoint sites using the application catalog, but still hosting the extension from the local host. So in this tutorial 4, we're taking until final step and actually packaging this extension to be hosted in your Office 365 CDN, and then you don't have to host those JavaScript files anymore locally from your box. So it's a kind of a production-ready deployment for this extension. So how we're going to do this is that we're going to take advantage of the Office 365 CDN. In this case, technically you can use and host these JavaScript files in any CDN, in Azure CDN, in whatever third-party location, as long as the URL can be accessed using HTTPS address in SharePoint Online. You can actually host your JavaScript files there. There's multiple considerations on where do you host the files and who has access on updating those files and all of that, which we do not address within this tutorial. The key point is to go through and make the final step for the final deployment. So like mentioned, in this case, we're going to take advantage of Office 365 CDN, and to be able to configure that, we need to use Microsoft PowerShell. So I'm going to open up a PowerShell console here in my machine, and we're going to actually connect to my tenant to get things actually moving. So I'm going to use the SharePoint Online Management Shell, which are SharePoint Online PowerShell commandlets, and we're going to use then connect SPO service, and for that one we'll need to pass in a parameter, which is the URL of the tenant admin site where we will be connecting. And in this case, we are connecting to the Splat tenant, so we're going to connect to that admin site .sharepoint.com. And that's going to then start the locking process, so I can sign in using the account to configure these things. You need to be a tenant administrator to enable Office 365 CDN and configure and do the basic configuration. So if you do not have the right permissions within your environment, you need to ask somebody to enable this for you. And it's a one-time setup, one-time thing based on the configurations what we will be doing. So I'm going to sign in right now using my own account in this particular tenant, which has the sufficient permissions. And there we go. So now that we're connected on the SharePoint tenant using the PowerShell, we can check the current situation of our CDN setup by running get SPO tenant CDN enabled. And then we need to bypass the CDN type. So in this case, we'll be using the public CDN. And we can check that what is the current situation of the public CDN. Is it enabled or disabled? There's also other commands available, like checking the CDN origins and CDN policies, which we're not going to deep dive in this tutorial, but those gives you additional insights on how what's the current setup of your Office 365 CDN and how to configure that. To be able to enable Office 365 CDN, we can actually execute, let me actually do that from here, set SPO tenant CDN enabled, and we're going to enable the public CDN. So that's going to ask a confirmation on this one. In our case, we are absolutely sure that this is what we want to do. So I'm going to press an A. So that's going to enable the CDN process within my tenant. And that means that the public CDN is now enabled. If you have, the locations which are in the tenant CDN origins are now accessible using anonymous access, but only if those assets are static. So basically the information and static assets like images or CSS files can be now accessed through a URL anonymously. And this is really for performance purposes as well, because this will increase the performance. And quite often, the fact that you're serving a JavaScript file, which is your actual implementation, not the content of your web part or an extension, the actual implementation of the extension, it's not actually that confidential, or it doesn't have to be fully secured, because the content is absolutely 100% secure, even though the image or JavaScript file, which is the implementation, wouldn't be 100% or would be exposed using anonymous access. If you have any concerns around, let's say, exposing things anonymously using the Office 365 CDN, we do recommend to have a close look on the CDN documentation. What does it actually mean? And think through alternative options. You can absolutely host all of the JavaScript files and assets directly in SharePoint as well, but then you won't get the CDN benefits, which is the clear performance impact or clear performance benefits, if you have end users accessing your SharePoint tenant from multiple different locations across the world. Now, if we quickly have a look on the basic setup, what's actually happened, we can see that the public CDN is enabled on following locations, so in a master base and a style library. So now, if we in this case, we want to actually add additional CDN origin, where we want to store all of our CDNs within our all of our web parts and SharePoint Framework extensions within our tenant. So in my case, or in this case, we're going to make it as simple as adding add SBO tenant CDN origin, and we're going to add that one to the CDN type being public, and we want to add an origin URL. So obviously, you can pinpoint a specific site, you can pinpoint a specific folder or a document library within your site collection or within your tenant to be the case. In our case, we're going to just use a wildcard with a CDN wildcard, which means that anywhere within my tenant, if somebody creates a document library called a CDN, that will be automatically served using the CDN functionality. Again, your setup absolutely depends on what you want to do based on your company policies and all of that. So now let's add that one in. Let's do an A as a confirmation for yes, we actually want to do that, and that is getting then configured within a site or within your tenant. And whenever that is getting actually properly configured with the SharePoint Online and the CDN provider, we can absolutely go and double check the situation using the get SBO tenant CDN origins as well. So some of these commands execution will take a while, again, depending on your network requirements and network behaviors. And now the CDN configuration has been applied. Now, there's one thing what you want to notice here. When I add that to new things and new locations to the CDN, there's this configuration bending message. So let me zoom on that one. So we added the CDN location in here, and you can see that there's this configuration bending message being shown. And this means that right now the CDN configuration for that location is not ready. So none of the content is yet getting served through the CDN. And you can always use the get CDN, get SBO tenant CDN origins and CDN type being public in this case, and we can always check when is the configuration properly applied. And this is the moment when SharePoint Online is talking to a CDN provider and making sure that the configuration is in sync between the provider and SharePoint Online. And this might take a while. It might take 5 to 10 to 15 minutes to actually get to be applied within your tenant. So for that reasons, before we actually move forward on the tutorial, we kind of pause until the configuration pending has been removed within a tenant, so we can actually get our stuff deployed within our CDN. So let's cut the video and continue whenever the configuration pending has been, or the pending configuration has been properly applied. And now, if we execute the get SPO tenant CDN origins, and you can see that the CDN configuration has been completed. So that took a while, but it's a one-time configuration within a tenant. So it's not like you need to wait that moment or the max 15 minutes for every single time you're deploying something. Now, in this case, we did use the wildcard CDN as the location, and that means that we can actually create a CDN folder or document library to any site within our tenant, and that would be served through CDN. Again, debatable if we want to do so. There's multiple aspects and on that discussion. But in our case, let's actually go to our tenant. This is the root of our tenant, and what we're going to do here is that we're going to simply create a document library called CDN, and we kind of use this as our location for our web part or for hosting of our assets and hosting all of our customizations. Well, in this case, we're talking about hosting the application customizer properly. So let's actually create one more folder here. So let's call this Hello World, where we actually want to store the assets for that particular application customizer and then serve the information from there. Now, to be able to serve and to be able to SharePoint understand that the location has been changed and that we are actually downloading and referencing these files through the CDN, we need to update certain settings within our code. So let's actually move back on our Visual Studio Code side, and in the Visual Studio Code, we're going to actually extend and update the URL accordingly and based on the new location. So the new URL will be based on a slightly different structure, and you can actually see this and you can copy the basic structure from the written tutorial version and also from the CDN documentation. Because we're using the public CDN, the prefix will be publiccdn.sharepointonline.com. And then in here, we are actually going to include the URL of our tenant. So in this case, let's actually go to our site. Let's copy the splat.sharepoint.com as the URL for that particular section. And that's where the location is being served. In our case, we are serving actually the library, the CDN library is located in the root of the tenant. So if we go back on the browser, and let me zoom in here, you can see that our CDN folder is located in the root of the tenant. Is that a good practice or bad practice? There's no such recommendation from our side. It's again based on your own policies and based on your own ways of doing deployments. So I'm going to update the URL accordingly in here. So I'm going to get rid of the sites and library and update that to be CDN. In the CDN folder, in my SharePoint Online site, we created the Hello World folder where we're going to actually upload our assets. So I'm going to actually copy that Hello World text. Let's copy that one from the URL so we absolutely get it correct. And back in here, I'm going to update that folder accordingly to be Hello World. So now this will be the URL where we will tell for SharePoint to load the JavaScript files related on our application customizer. Now we're good to go. So that was the only thing what we were forced to update. So that's the new location and upcoming location for our assets. And now let's actually make sure that we get all of these things working and we update the existing instances of application extensions and we make things to work properly. So saving changes, I'm going to flip back on my console. So in here, let's actually do gulp bundle and -- ship. And this actually means that we are making optimized bundle for shipping this in production usage. So that's going to do the bundling of the solution. And then we kind of run gulp package solution and with the ship switch as well. So gulp package solution -- ship. And this means that we are actually taking that updated URL and putting that one and referencing that URL accordingly to the actual solution. Now, Then we need to make sure that we are actually getting all of our stuff updated properly and getting our JavaScript files served from the CDN. So first things first, let's double check just in case that our URL configuration was done accordingly. So let's go to the SharePoint folder, let's go to the solution folder, let's open up the debug folder, and in here open up the extension XML. In here, if I do a word wrap, we can actually double check that the URL was updated accordingly. So that is now pointing to that URL. And that means that we need to get the assets available to that URL. So let's do that. So I'm going to go to the command line. I'm going to open up an Explorer in this folder. There we go. And in the temp folder and deploy folder, so temp deploy, you can actually find those assets which we need to get deployed on the CDN. Let's actually do that. So let's put this one on this side. Let's go to our CDN, which was the Hello World folder in here. I'm going to slightly put that in a smaller space, and then I'm going to drag and drop those 3 files into that document library, or that folder within a document library. And there we go. Those 3 files are now being served from SharePoint side whenever the URLs are hitting the public CDN URL. Now, currently the solution SPPKG file, which is in the app catalog, is still loading stuff from a local host. So if the local host is not running, it will run into an issue. So we need to update that. So we actually already did the package solution ship. So we did create a new version of the SPPKG file in the SharePoint solution folder. So there's our new version of SPPKG file where the URL has been updated accordingly to the CDN URL. So let's actually get that one uploaded to the app catalog. So I'm going to drag and drop that one in. There is already an app extension SPPKG. We know that. Let's replace that. And in this moment, the existing instances of the application customizer are getting reflected on a change as well. So now there will be the confirmation. We can actually double check the URL setting is correct. So we're loading our stuff from the CDN, clicking deploy. And now if we go back on the site where we had already installed the application client-side extension solution, we should see these things to be reflected. So now if we click back on the site, if we click Themes, you can actually see that we're in the site and our application customizer is getting rendered properly within the site. And the key point to notice here is that within a command line, we're not running the local host. So all of these assets are actually coming from the CDN. So now if I move across the site contents, if I move across to any of the pages within a site, we actually are getting this application customizer with the content placeholders being rendered, with the settings which we actually deployed on the site as well. So everything is now working properly. You can also double check that where the assets are getting deployed by opening up the console, for example, in Chrome, really depending on where which one you're actually using or which browser you're actually using. In our case, we can absolutely see the assets being rendered properly from the CDN. So if we load this one more time with a Control F5, we can see that there's a public CDN reference. If we extend that one, we can actually absolutely see our application extension JavaScript files getting rendered from this location. So those are the 2 files which are now getting rendered from the public CDN, which was actually the location where the files are in here. And that's super convenient because now if you need to update anything, you can just you can do the updates just within the SharePoint because you don't have any other let's say players involved. It's only the SharePoint folders and libraries and SharePoint tenant where you need to update the JavaScript files and update the application definitions, and then those changes will be reflected within the site as well. But that's all what we're going to do in this video. So thanks for watching this one. This has been the tutorial series 1, 2, and 3 around the AK Hello World getting started tutorial. We started by creating an application customizer. We tested that it actually works using the application customizer query parameters and debugging query parameters. We modified the customizer to actually have the top and bottom placeholders where we then injected some code or added some content. In the third step, we tested that it's actually working properly when it's hosted from a local host without the query parameters. And then in this fourth step, we actually deployed this to the CDN. So all good, and thank you for watching the tutorial. Please keep on watching the other ones as well. Get familiar with SharePoint Framework. It is all GA, right? It is all available for you to use in SharePoint Online right now. Thank you.